Okay, good afternoon. This is Richard Hsu, host of Hsu Untied. Today I'm very pleased to have with me as my guest Tom Duley, who's a partner at Sidley in Austin. Tom, welcome to the program.
Nice to be with you, Richard.
So, Tom, you have one of the more interesting and unusual backgrounds of the many lawyers I have interviewed, and that is that it looks like you were actually an architect before you went to law school. Tell me, how did you get into that profession?
Well, that's true, and there aren't too many architects turned lawyers, so I'm not
Oh,
surprised you haven't encountered another one.
no.
Yeah, so I was, I was an undergrad in English literature, and candidly, I didn't at that point know what I wanted to do. I was working in the summers as a carpenter, and was intrigued by the architectural profession, and about sort of halfway through my undergrad degree, I started thinking about switching over to architecture. And for a variety of reasons, I didn't do it immediately. I decided to go ahead and finish my undergrad in literature. But I started preparing to go into a grad school program, master's program in architecture. And so I was, on the one hand, taking, Shakespeare and Milton and all this other kind of stuff. And at the same time, I was enrolling in, calculus and physics and stuff like that. So, and then I found myself after graduating, I applied to grad schools in architecture, and I was off in that direction as a career at that point in time.
Now, did you have a family of architects? Were you familiar with the profession at all? Nothing like that?
No, I grew up in my dad was handy, so I sort of acquired, I would guess, I would say kind of, handyman type skills. And I was like I said, I was intrigued by construction and was working as a carpenter, basically, and a construction laborer during college. And I just liked being around that environment. I liked building things. I liked seeing plans turn into buildings. And the idea of designing those buildings was appealing to me, just really interesting. And one of the things that appealed to me about it, I think, was just kind of the inherently multidisciplinary nature of architecture. There's certainly a creative element to it, which is really important. There's a humanistic element to it. Buildings are kind of part of our society, if you will.
Yeah.
And yet there are also technical things, right? There's engineering behind them and planning and all of that. And so it's a field that really brings together a lot of different ways of thinking about the world and interacting with different types of people. And I just found that really interesting.
Now, did you do mostly residential or commercial buildings? What kind of architecture stuff did you do?
No, I did a lot of laboratory buildings, to be honest with you, which became somewhat relevant later on. But I had the good fortune while I was in architecture school. So this, not unlike law school, the program that I went through was a 3-year sort of post-baccalaureate program. And I had the good fortune starting in my second summer to be kind of akin to what the legal profession would think of as a summer associate, but it was really just an intern, if you will, for an architect who was already pretty well known at that time in Los Angeles, Frank Gehry. And so I started interning at his office in that final summer between my second and third year. I worked there through the course of my third year, and then I wound up working there full time for several years after I graduated. And by that point in time, and this is late 80s, Frank was getting commissions all over the world to design all sorts of different buildings. His career was really taking off at that time. So I worked on projects that were pretty large scale, concert halls, high-rise buildings, large-scale laboratory buildings, projects in Europe, projects in Asia, projects in the U.S. Just it was a really varied experience.
What was the most interesting project you worked on, or maybe the most famous building you worked on, would you say?
Well, the most famous one was when I was there. What became the Disney Concert Hall was in its very early stages, and it was originally, as is often the case in major architectural commissions, it was the subject of a competition. And so Frank and team put together a competition submission for what became the Disney Concert Hall. He won that competition, but it took many years and a lot of trials and troubles, but that building was finally constructed long after I had left Frank's firm. And then I worked on all sorts of different other buildings along the way. I was there for 3 years as a full-time architect, and it was a small office back in those days. So pretty much anybody who worked on there touched almost anything that was going on during that period of time. But I worked most closely and for the longest period of time on a building called the Iowa Laser Lab, which was at Iowa University. And it was just like the name suggests, it was a laser laboratory right on the banks of the Iowa River. And so I spent a lot of time there in Iowa.
So did you like architecture profession? Was it, I mean, obviously you ultimately did something else, but at the time, did it seem like something you really enjoyed, or what was your sense?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because obviously, and I'm sure we'll get to this, I did make a career change, but certainly the time that I worked at Frank Gehry's office, it was an unparalleled sort of experience. I mean, and I learned a lot, and it was I wouldn't trade it for anything, really. But it's a tough way to make a living, and for a variety of reasons, I had left the LA area, wound up here in San Francisco, where I am now, and I was working for an architecture firm here, and I had sort of one eye on the economy, which was headed down, and I was working on, at that time, I was working on a materials science laboratory building for Boeing aircraft, and I was reading the newspapers and seeing airlines, canceling plane orders left and right, and so I sort of had one eye on the economy. And then at the same time, I had always been intrigued by law. My father insisted that I should go to law school at some point, and I think he didn't care whatever I did after that. I could have been a bum on the street. He wouldn't have cared as long as I'd gotten a law degree. So there was always that kind of family pressure. But I decided to take a couple of night classes in law while I was still working as an architect.
Yeah.
And to my surprise, I took a torts class and a legal writing class at Golden Gate University, and I really liked them. I mean, genuinely, I really was intrigued and sort of inspired by them. And I talked to a bunch of friends of mine who were lawyers at that time, and they said, look, their advice was, if you can, cut the cord and go full time to law school. Don't try to do two things at once. And in retrospect, I think that was good advice. So I decided to resign as an architect and go to law school full time. And it was a bit of a leap of faith, but it worked out.
Did you like law school as much as you liked those two classes? I mean, was it truly did you feel like that was really more your calling?
Yeah, I did. I was lucky, I guess. Not everybody has a good law school experience. I did. I went to UC Davis. It was a good school, a school where, the student body was collaborative. The faculty was genuinely interested, I think, in teaching. And it was overall a very good experience.
Now, it looks like your legal career, you've done a number of interesting things. You were in-house, you were a litigator, and now it looks like you're more of a transactional lawyer. Kind of walk me through how your legal career kind of evolved.
Yeah, it's very non-linear. um, yeah, so I alluded to kind of the impending recession when I made the decision to go to law school. That recession, so we're talking early 90s now, that recession was still kind of in place at the time, and there weren't a ton of opportunities, but and I remember, incidentally, going through the on-campus interview process, and one of the partners from Sonnenschein, Nath, and Rosenthal, a firm that no longer exists by name, they're now Dentons, but that partner was intrigued by my architecture background, and he and I spent the entire OCI interview talking about architecture. And that was the place where I ultimately started as a summer associate and then an associate. And I was doing the only game in town that was offered to me at that time, which was insurance litigation, coverage litigation. And it was a great experience. I was out taking depositions, showing up in court, and arguing motions and things like that. And it was really interesting. In the late 90s, and I was interested in tech. And so I moved into basically patent litigation, but primarily in the semiconductor space. Yet another change. And then I think it was probably 99, a good friend of mine who at the time was a senior associate at Cooley Godward, he called me up, Stephen Rosenfield. Thank you very much to Stephen, because he called me up and said one day, our biotech licensing group, meaning at Cooley, is really in need of people, and they might even be willing to entertain a fifth-year litigator. And so one thing led to another, and that was kind of where I switched horses and started doing what I do today, and that was the year 2000.
Wow. And then tell me about you had a slight in-house experience too. What was that like?
Yeah, that was awesome and so important to who I am as a lawyer today, to be honest with you. As you may have heard, I'm sure through the many people you've spoken with over the years, an in-house experience is very different than being a lawyer at a big law firm.
Sure.
And so I was at a company originally called Protein Design Labs, later PDL Biopharma, and it was a public company, but it was small by pharmaceutical company standards, but it was what we call a fully integrated biopharma company, meaning there was early stage research, there was clinical development, there was antibody manufacturing, and there were 3 commercial products which the company sold. And so when I went in-house, I was, just every day was an education about how a biopharma company actually runs, the nuts and bolts and day-to-day operations of it. And it was just a fascinating experience. I worked with everybody across the organization, every functional group, every level of employee, from manager to director to C-suite to board. And it was just a fascinating experience with all of the many challenges and questions, legal questions and business questions that come across a desk. It was an invaluable experience, and still today, this was 2005, 6, 7, that area. Still today, I work with people that I met and worked with at PDL back then.
Interesting. Do you feel like you get to use any of your architecture skills at all in any way, or is that or not really?
Well, so on occasion, I have been asked to deal with construction build-out type questions, including when I was in-house at PDL. So there's certainly that aspect to it, but at a little bit higher level of abstraction, I would say, both endeavors, obviously they're different, right? But both endeavors involve a lot of problem solving. And I work on, I handle mainly licensing and partnering deals. And those types of transactions are the beginning of a relationship between two parties. And so you have to come to those transactions with a sort of a spirit of finding out what works because the contract marks the beginning of the relationship, not the end of it. And I think that kind of just overall problem solving mentality that I cultivated to a certain extent as an architect still is relevant to what I do today.
What does your father think about your legal career now?
Well, he's no longer with us, but he was very, very happy when I went to law school and graduated from law school. There's no question about that.
Well, Tom, let's see. So you've been an architect, you were in-house, you've been a litigator, you went to law school, you've been at big firms. Anything else in your future? Do you see another career path, or what do you think?
I've learned, and certainly, my career path is evidence. Never say never, right? I'm very happy doing what I'm doing now. I enjoy working with. I'm really privileged to work with the client base that we have, and with fantastic colleagues. It's just really a joy in that regard, and so. Who knows? Maybe, bartender at a ski resort. I don't know.
Well, Tom, it's been wonderful chatting with you. It's great hearing about your career. And if you do decide to do something else, please come back and tell me about it.
I will do that, Richard. Thank you very much.
This is Richard Hsu and Tom Duley. Thanks.